Jasmine Washington stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, watching New York's elite mingle in their designer gowns and expensive suits. She felt like she was watching a movie about people from another planet. The crystal chandelier above cast sparkles across the marble floor, and servers in white gloves carried silver trays of champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She adjusted her simple black dress, the nicest one she owned, and reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about fitting in with these people. This was about her work, about fighting for families who couldn't afford decent housing, about making sure kids had safe places to sleep at night. The Community Housing Foundation had sent her to represent them at this charity gala, and she wasn't going to let her discomfort stop her from doing her job. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else right now," a voice said behind her. Jasmine turned around and found herself looking into the warmest brown eyes she'd ever seen. The man standing there was tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and he wore his expensive tuxedo like he wished he could take it off. Unlike everyone else in the room, he actually looked genuine. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, surprised by his directness. He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Only because I feel exactly the same way. I'm Alexander, by the way. Alexander Wilson." He extended his hand, and when she shook it, his grip was firm but gentle. "Jasmine Washington. I work with the Community Housing Foundation. The group that just won the big case against those landlords in Brooklyn. That was incredible work." His eyes lit up with real interest, not the polite, fake enthusiasm she'd been getting all evening. Jasmine blinked in surprise. "You actually know about that?" "Of course I do. What you did for those families was amazing. Those kids finally have heat in winter because of you." Alexander's voice carried genuine admiration. "That takes real courage, going up against developers with that much money and power." For the first time all evening, Jasmine felt herself relax. It wasn't just me. We had a whole team, and the families themselves were so brave. They risked everything to speak up. But someone had to lead that fight. Someone had to believe it was possible to win. Alexander leaned against the wall beside her, suddenly looking less like a wealthy socialite and more like a regular person. "Can I ask you something? How do you keep going when the system seems stacked against you?" The question caught her off guard. Most people at events like this asked her about her dress or the weather, not about the deeper meaning of her work. "I think about my grandmother," she said honestly. "She used to clean offices in downtown Detroit, working night shifts. She could take care of me during the day. She'd come home exhausted, but she never complained. She used to tell me that every small victory matters, that change happens one person at a time." Alexander nodded slowly. "Your grandmother sounds like an incredible woman." "She is. She's the reason I became a lawyer. She always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." Jasmine found herself sharing more than she usually did with strangers. "What about you? What brings you to these fancy events?" A shadow crossed Alexander's face. "Family. Expectations mostly. My father thinks I should be networking, making connections, carrying on the family tradition." He gestured toward the crowd. "But honestly, I'd rather be reading a good book or having a real conversation with someone who cares about making the world better." "What kind of books do you like?" Jasmine asked, curious about this man who seemed so different from everyone else here. "Everything, really. I just finished reading about the civil rights movement, actually. There's this book about ordinary people who did extraordinary things just because they knew it was right." His eyes met hers. "Kind of like what you do every day." They talked for another hour, finding a quiet corner where they could hear each other over the music. Alexander told her about growing up in a world where money solved everything, but feeling like something important was missing. Jasmine shared stories about her work, about the family she'd helped, about the community center where she volunteered. On weekends, "You know what's funny? Alexander said as the evening wound down. I've been to probably 100 of these events, and I've never had a conversation that actually mattered. Not until tonight. Jasmine felt a flutter in her stomach. I almost didn't come. I kept thinking I didn't belong here. But you do belong here. More than most of these people, actually. You're here because you're fighting for something real. Alexander hesitated, then added, would you maybe want to get coffee sometime? Somewhere a lot less fancy than this? Jasmine studied his face, looking for any sign that this was just another wealthy guy trying to add her to his collection of experiences. But all she saw was genuine interest and a kind of hopefulness that made her heart skip. I'd like that, she said simply. They exchanged phone numbers, and Alexander insisted on walking her to her car. As they stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel, the city humming around them, he said, thank you for tonight. For reminding me that there are still people out there fighting the good fight. Thank you for seeing the work as more than just a job, Jasmine replied. That means more than you know. As she drove home to her small apartment in Queens, Jasmine couldn't stop thinking about the evening. She'd gone to the gala expecting to feel out of place and uncomfortable, but instead she'd met someone who seemed to understand her in a way that surprised her. Alexander didn't talk down to her or try to impress her with his wealth. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her work. Her phone buzzed with a text message just as she was getting ready for bed. Thank you again for tonight. I haven't smiled that much in months. Looking forward to that coffee. Alexander, she smiled as she typed back, me too, sweet dreams. What Jasmine didn't know was that Alexander Wilson was actually Alexander Sterling III, heir to one of the biggest fortunes in America. He'd given her a different last name because he'd learned long ago that people treated him differently when they knew who his family was. For the first time in his life, someone had gotten to know him just as Alexander, not as the Sterling heir, and it felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. As he lay in his bed in his penthouse apartment, Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this excited about getting to know someone. Jasmine was everything his world wasn't: genuine, passionate, grounded in something real. She fought for people who had nothing. While he'd grown up with everything but had never felt like he was making a difference, he thought about her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her work, the quiet strength in her voice. When she spoke about her grandmother. Tomorrow he would call her about that coffee, and maybe, just maybe, he could figure out how to tell her the truth about who he really was, without losing the connection they'd found tonight. 3 months had passed since that first coffee date, and Jasmine couldn't believe how much her life had changed. What started as a simple meeting at a small cafe in Brooklyn had turned into something she never expected. Alexander wasn't like any man she'd ever met, and not because of his money, which she still didn't fully understand the extent of. Every Tuesday, they met at Rosa's Diner on the corner of 5th Avenue and Union Street. It was their special place, far from the fancy restaurants where Alexander usually ate with business associates. The owner, Mrs. Rosa, had started saving them their favorite booth by the window, and she always made sure to bring extra coffee refills when she saw them deep in conversation. Tell me more about your grandmother, Alexander said one Tuesday morning, watching Jasmine's face light up the way it always did when she talked about family. Grandma Betty is something else, Jasmine said, stirring sugar into her coffee. She's 78 years old and still volunteers at 3 different community centers. Last week, she organized a book drive for kids in the neighborhood. Got over 500 books donated. Alexander smiled. She sounds amazing. I'd love to meet her someday. Jasmine looked at him carefully. They'd been spending so much time together. But she still felt like there were parts of his life he kept hidden. He talked about his work in vague terms, always changing the subject when she asked too many questions. She knew he came from money. That much was obvious from his clothes and the way he carried himself, but he seemed almost embarrassed by it. She'd Like you, Jasmine said finally. She's always telling me I need to find a good man who treats me right. Someone who listens when I talk and doesn't try to change me. Your grandmother is a wise woman, Alexander said, reaching across the table to take her hand. I hope I measure up to her standards. The truth was, Alexander had been thinking about meeting Jasmine's family for weeks. She talked about them constantly. Her parents who both worked double shifts to make ends meet, her younger brother studying engineering at community college, her grandmother who had raised half the neighborhood kids at one point or another. They sounded like the kind of family he'd always dreamed of having, the kind where people actually cared about each other instead of just caring about appearances. His own family was a different story entirely. He hadn't told them about Jasmine, and the thought of doing so made his stomach twist with anxiety. The Sterling family had very specific ideas about who their children should date, and a civil rights lawyer from Detroit definitely didn't fit their image of an appropriate match. Alexander, Jasmine said gently, you seem worried about something. Is everything okay? He squeezed her hand. Just work stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. But it wasn't work that was bothering him. It was the growing weight of the lies he was telling, or at least the truths he wasn't sharing. Every time Jasmine introduced him to someone as Alexander Wilson, he felt like he was betraying her trust. But how could he explain that he'd given her a fake last name, because his real one came with too much baggage? Their relationship had developed into a comfortable routine that both of them treasured. Saturday mornings were for long walks through Prospect Park, where they'd grab coffee from a street vendor and find a quiet bench to sit and talk. Alexander loved watching Jasmine feed the ducks while she told him about her cases, her passion for justice making her eyes sparkle in a way that took his breath away. Sunday afternoons were for museums. Alexander had been surprised to discover that Jasmine loved art as much as he did, though she approached it differently. Where he analyzed technique and historical context, she connected emotionally with the pieces, seeing stories in every painting. Look at this one, she said during a visit to the Metropolitan Museum, standing in front of a painting of a woman reading a letter. She's getting news that's going to change her whole life. You can see it in her face. She's scared but hopeful. At the same time, Alexander studied both the painting and Jasmine's expression. How do you always see the human story in everything? Because that's what matters, she said simply. All the technical stuff is interesting, but at the end of the day, art is about people and feelings and experiences we all share. It was moments like these that made Alexander fall deeper in love with her. Jasmine had a way of cutting through everything complicated and getting to the heart of what really mattered. She saw the world through eyes that looked for connection and meaning, not profit and status. Their weekday evenings were often spent at Alexander's apartment in Soho, a modest place by his family's standards but comfortable and warm. He'd bought it years ago when he wanted a space that felt like his own, somewhere his family rarely visited because it wasn't grand enough for their taste. With Jasmine there, cooking dinner together or curled up on the couch watching old movies, it finally felt like home. I never pictured you as someone who could cook, Jasmine teased one evening as Alexander carefully stirred pasta sauce. My family had a chef growing up, but I spent a lot of time in the kitchen with her. Maria taught me that cooking for someone you care about is one of the best ways to show love. He glanced at her. Plus, I wanted to impress you. You impressed me the first night we met, Jasmine said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. This is just a nice bonus. These quiet domestic moments were what Alexander treasured most. When it was just the two of them, away from the complications of their different worlds, everything felt simple and right. He could almost forget about the Sterling name and everything that came with it, but the weight of keeping secrets was getting harder to bear. Last week, Jasmine had asked him directly about his family, and he'd given her vague answers about being from New York and having complicated relationships with his parents. She'd looked hurt by his evasiveness, though she hadn't pushed. "I want you to meet my parents," she said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "They're coming to visit next weekend, and I've told them so much about you." Alexander's heart jumped. "Are you sure?" "I mean, what if they don't like me?" Jasmine laughed. "Are you kidding? My mom is already planning what to cook for you. And my dad wants to know if you follow basketball, because apparently we need to watch the game together." The warmth in her voice made Alexander's chest tight with emotion. This was what family was supposed to feel like: welcoming, inclusive, built on love instead of obligation. "I'd love to meet them," he said, meaning it completely. What he didn't say was that meeting her family would make it even harder to keep hiding his own background. Every day that passed made him more certain that he was going to have to tell Jasmine the truth about who he really was. The question that kept him awake at night was whether she'd understand why he'd felt the need to hide it, or whether she'd see it as a betrayal of the trust they'd built together. For now, though he pushed those worries aside and focused on the Figo woman in his arms, the one who had brought more joy into his life in 3 months than he'd felt in years. Whatever came next, he knew that loving Jasmine was the most real thing he'd ever experienced. Alexander's hands were shaking as he drove through the gates of the Sterling family estate in the Hamptons. The massive iron gates with the family crest always made him feel small, even after all these years. Today, they felt like prison bars. Closing behind him, Jasmine sat in the passenger seat, looking out at the manicured lawns and fountains with wide eyes. "This is where you grew up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Alexander said, his throat tight. "I know it's a lot." A lot was an understatement. The Sterling mansion sprawled across 15 acres, with its own tennis court, swimming pool, and gardens that required a team of 12 gardeners to maintain. Alexander had called his mother 3 days ago to tell her he was bringing someone special to meet the family. He'd finally worked up the courage to use his real last name with Jasmine just last week, sitting in their favorite booth. "At Rosa's Diner, Sterling?" Jasmine had repeated, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "As in Sterling Industries?" "I wanted to tell you sooner," Alexander had said quickly. "I just ... I liked being Alexander Wilson with you, just Alexander. Not the heir to anything, not someone people wanted to meet because of my family's money." Jasmine had been quiet for a long time, processing this information. "So you've been lying to me for 8 months? Not lying exactly. More like ... not telling the whole truth." Alexander had reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I was scared you'd see me differently." She'd looked at him with those honest brown eyes he'd fallen in love with. "Alexander, I don't care about your money. I care about you, but I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me." "I trust you completely," he'd said. "I was just protecting what we have. It's the most real thing in my life." Now, as they walked up the marble steps to the front door, Alexander wished he'd found a way to prepare her better. His mother, Victoria Sterling, opened the door herself, which was unusual. She usually let the staff handle such things. "Alexander, darling," Victoria said, her smile cold and perfectly practiced. She was wearing a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Her eyes swept over Jasmine with the kind of look people give when they're evaluating a piece of furniture they're thinking about buying. "Mother, this is Jasmine Washington." "Jasmine, my mother, Victoria Sterling." Jasmine stepped forward with a genuine smile, extending her hand. "Mrs. Sterling, it's wonderful to meet you. Alexander has told me so much about his family." Victoria shook Jasmine's hand briefly, her smile never reaching her eyes. "How ... interesting. Please come in. Your father is waiting in the drawing room, Alexander." The drawing room was exactly as Alexander remembered, all cream and gold, with furniture that looked expensive but felt cold. His father, Alexander Sterling II, stood by the fireplace in his perfectly pressed suit, looking like he was posing for a magazine cover. His sister Carolyn sat in one of the wingback chairs, already dressed for dinner, even though it was only 3 o'clock. "So this is the young woman we've been hearing about," his father said, his voice neutral but his eyes calculating. "Alexander. Tells us you're a lawyer." "Yes, sir. I work in civil rights law, primarily housing discrimination cases." Jasmine's voice was steady, professional, but Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders. "How noble," Carolyn said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "It must be so fulfilling to help those people." The way she said "those people" made Alexander's jaw clench. "Jasmine just won a major case against some of the biggest developers in Brooklyn," he said firmly. "She's incredibly talented." "I'm sure she is," Victoria said, settling into her chair like a queen on a throne. "Tell me, dear, where did you attend school?" "University of Michigan for undergrad, then Wayne State for law school," Jasmine replied. "Both excellent schools with strong programs in social justice." Alexander watched his family's faces carefully. He could see them mentally calculating, comparing Jasmine's state schools to the Ivy League institutions they considered appropriate. It made him sick. "State schools," his father said, as if he was commenting on the weather. "How practical." The conversation continued like this for another hour, with his family asking polite questions that felt more like job interview queries than getting to know you conversation. They asked about her family background, her neighborhood, her career goals, all with the kind of subtle condescension that made Alexander want to grab Jasmine's hand and leave immediately. But Jasmine handled it all with incredible grace. She answered every question honestly, talked about her grandmother's influence on her life, described her work with genuine passion. She was being completely herself, which only made his family's coldness more obvious and painful. "Dinner is served," the butler announced, and they moved to the formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and table that could seat 20 people. The dinner was a nightmare. Carolyn had invited 3 other guests, all wealthy young women, from prominent families who just happened to be single. The message was clear. These were the kind of women Alexander should be dating. "Brittany just got back from spending the summer in Monaco," Caroline said, gesturing to a blonde woman in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "She's been telling me about the most amazing yacht parties." "How wonderful," Jasmine said politely, though Alexander could see her growing uncomfortable with the obvious setup. "And Madison here just opened her own art gallery in the Upper East Side," Victoria added, smiling at another woman. "Such an impressive venture for someone so young." The conversation continued to center around the other women's accomplishments. Their charity work with exclusive organizations, their connections to famous families, their expensive hobbies. Alexander watched Jasmine grow quieter as the evening progressed, and he felt his anger building. "Jasmine's work is incredibly important too," he said during a brief pause. "She's helping families who have nowhere else to turn." "Of course," Victoria said with a patronizing smile. "Community service is so important. Though I do wonder about the long-term prospects in that field. I mean, how does one build a proper life doing that kind of work?" The implication was clear. Jasmine's career wasn't good enough, stable enough, profitable enough for their family. "I build a proper life by helping people who need it," Jasmine said quietly, her voice steady, but Alexander could hear the hurt underneath. "By fighting for families who can't fight for themselves." "How admirable," Caroline said in a tone that suggested she found it anything but admirable. "Though I suppose it must be difficult, being around so much. Struggle all the time." Alexander had had enough. "Jasmine's work makes a real difference in the world," he said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "She's accomplished more in her career than most people do in a lifetime." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Victoria cleared her throat delicately. "Of course, dear. We're simply trying to understand Jasmine's world better." After dinner, Alexander's father asked to speak with him privately in his study. Alexander knew what was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the coldness in his father's voice. "She's not right for our family, Alexander," his father said without preamble. "Surely you can see that. What I see is a woman who's intelligent, compassionate, and genuine," Alexander replied, his hands clenched into fists. "She's from a completely different world. Different background, different values, different expectations." His father's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing a business deal. "This kind of relationship never works out in the long run." "You mean she's not white and wealthy enough for your standards?" His father's expression didn't change. "I mean she doesn't understand our world, our responsibilities, our way of life. The Sterling name comes with certain obligations, Alexander. You can't just throw that away for a passing infatuation. This isn't a passing infatuation. I love her." "Love," his father said dismissively. "You're young, Alexander. You'll understand when you're older that love isn't enough to bridge the kind of differences you're talking about." The conversation ended with an ultimatum: end the relationship or face the consequences. Alexander knew what those consequences meant: being cut off from the family, losing his inheritance, being disowned entirely. When he found Jasmine in the garden, she was sitting on a stone bench, staring out at the perfectly manicured landscape. The moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks, and Alexander felt his heart break. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting beside her. "I'm so sorry about tonight. They hate me," she said simply. "And not because of anything I said or did. They hate me because of who I am, where I come from." Alexander pulled her close, feeling her trembling against him. "Their opinion doesn't matter. What matters is us." But even as he said it, he could see the doubt in her eyes, the hurt that his family's rejection had caused. And he knew that everything had changed between them, that the easy happiness they'd shared for 8 months was now shadowed by the ugly reality of his family's prejudice and the impossible choice they were forcing him to make. The weeks following the dinner at the Sterling estate felt like living in a fog. Alexander sat in his Soho apartment, staring at his phone for the 100th time that day, wanting to call Jasmine but not knowing what to say. 3 weeks had passed since their last real conversation, and every day felt heavier than the last. His family's ultimatum echoed in his head constantly. "Choose the family legacy or lose everything," his father had said during their final conversation. "But understand, Alexander, if you choose her, there's no coming back." The pressure had been relentless. His mother called daily with updates about suitable women she wanted him to meet. Carolyn stopped by his apartment unannounced, bringing along different socialites each time. Even his business partners, longtime family associates, suddenly had opinions about his personal life. "You're being foolish," his mother had said during her latest visit. "This girl has obviously gotten into your head, but you need to think practically. What kind of life can you build with someone from her background?" The worst part was that for a moment, just a brief, terrible moment, Alexander had wondered if they were right. Not about Jasmine's worth, he knew she was incredible, but about whether their worlds were too different to bridge. The doubt had crept in during sleepless nights, whispering questions he hated himself for thinking. That doubt had led to the most painful conversation of his life. He'd met Jasmine at Rosa's Diner, their special place, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Surrounded by the warmth and authenticity they'd always found there, he'd tried to explain the impossible situation his family was putting him in. "They want me to choose," he'd said, his voice breaking. "And I don't know how to choose between my family and the woman I love." Jasmine had looked at him with those honest brown eyes, and he'd seen something break inside her. "Alexander, if you have to choose, then you've already made your choice." "That's not fair," he'd said desperately. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "You're right, I don't understand," she'd replied, her voice steady but her hands shaking around her coffee cup. I don't understand how someone can love another person, but still need to think about whether they're worth losing money over. It's not about the money, isn't it? Jasmine had stood up then, gathering her purse with the kind of dignity that made his heart ache. Alexander, I would never ask you to choose between me and your family. That's not love, that's manipulation. But the fact that you're even considering their ultimatum tells me everything I need to know. She'd walked away that day, and Alexander had let her go. He'd sat in that booth for 2 hours afterward, staring at the door and hoping she'd come back, knowing she wouldn't. The separation that followed was agony. Alexander threw himself into work, taking meetings he didn't care about, reviewing contracts that meant nothing to him. His family seemed pleased with his apparent decision, assuming he'd chosen them over Jasmine. But every day felt like a betrayal of everything real he'd ever found. Meanwhile, Jasmine was building something extraordinary. Alexander couldn't help himself from following the news about her work. She'd taken on a massive case against a group of developers who were trying to force low-income families out of their neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of fight she'd always been passionate about, but now she was doing it with a fierce intensity. That took everyone by surprise. Local attorney takes on city's biggest developers, read the headline in the New York Times. Alexander read every word of the article, feeling proud and heartbroken at the same time. The reporter described Jasmine as a force of nature in the courtroom, fighting with the passion of someone who truly understands what's at stake for these families. He watched from a distance as she appeared on local news shows, spoke at community meetings, and organized rallies. She was becoming everything she'd always had the potential to be, and she was doing it without him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She didn't need his family's approval or his money or even him. She was building her own legacy, fighting her own battles, making a difference that mattered. It was during one of those sleepless nights, scrolling through news articles about her latest victory, that Alexander finally understood what he'd lost. This wasn't just about choosing between Jasmine and his family's money. This was about choosing between living an authentic life and living a lie. He thought about their 8 months together, about the man he'd been with her. In Jasmine's presence, he'd discovered parts of himself he never knew existed. He'd learned what it felt like to care about something bigger than profit margins and stock prices. He'd experienced the joy of being loved for who he really was, not what he represented. His family's money had never made him happy. Their approval had never filled the emptiness he'd felt for most of his life. But 8 months with Jasmine had shown him what happiness actually looked like. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Alexander was walking past Rosa's diner when he saw Mrs. Rosa putting up a for sale sign in the window. He went inside, and the old woman's face lit up when she saw him. "Alexander, I was hoping you'd come by. Where's your beautiful girlfriend? I haven't seen you two in weeks." "Where?" "Not." "We're taking a break," Alexander said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. Mrs. Rosa's expression softened. "Ah, young love, it's never easy. But that girl, she loves you very much. I see it in her eyes every time she looks at you." "She was here recently?" "Last week. She ordered 2 coffees out of habit, then sat in your booth and cried." Mrs. Rosa shook her head sadly. "Whatever happened between you two, fix it. Love like that doesn't come around often." Walking home in the rain, Alexander finally admitted the truth to himself. He'd been a coward. He'd let his family's prejudice and his own fear drive away the best thing that ever happened to him. Jasmine deserved better than someone who needed time to decide if she was worth fighting for. That night, he made a decision that should have been easy from the beginning. He called his father and told him he was choosing Jasmine, choosing love, choosing the life he actually wanted to live. The conversation was brutal and final. His father's last words were, "Don't come crawling back when this falls apart." But Alexander felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time since that terrible dinner at his family's estate, He could breathe properly. He'd chosen authenticity over approval, love over legacy. Now came the hard part, convincing Jasmine to give him another chance. He knew he'd hurt her deeply, knew she might not be able to forgive him for wavering when she needed him to be strong. But he had to try. He spent 3 days planning what he would say, how he would prove to her that he'd changed, that he was ready to be the man she deserved. The answer came to him while he was walking through the community garden in Detroit, where they'd had one of their first real conversations about their dreams. Standing in that same spot, surrounded by the vegetables and flowers that neighborhood families had planted together, Alexander knew exactly how he wanted to ask Jasmine to marry him. Not in some expensive restaurant or exotic location, but here, in the place that represented everything she cared about: community, growth, and the belief that beautiful things could bloom anywhere if they were tended with love. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and cloudy in Detroit, but Jasmine had never felt more beautiful. She stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite of the historic Elmwood Manor, a gorgeous old mansion that had been restored by the local community. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, not the designer gown the Sterling family had probably expected, but one that made her feel like herself. "You look absolutely radiant," her mother said, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to Jasmine's great-grandmother. "I've never seen you this happy." Jasmine smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. After Alexander's proposal in the community garden 6 months ago, everything had changed. He'd shown up at her apartment with dirt under his fingernails and tears in his eyes, telling her he'd chosen her over everything else his family represented. "I don't want their money if it means losing you," he'd said, dropping to one knee right there among the tomato plants. "I want to build something real with you, something that matters." The engagement hadn't been easy. The Sterling family had tried everything to stop the wedding. They'd called vendors to cancel bookings, spread rumors in social circles, and even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Jasmine's family. But for every obstacle they created, the Detroit community had rallied to help. When the original caterer mysteriously canceled, Mrs. Rosa and 5 other local restaurant owners had volunteered to provide the food. When the florist suddenly became unavailable, the community garden where Alexander had proposed had donated flowers that Jasmine's neighbors arranged into the most beautiful bouquets she'd ever seen. 5 minutes, sweetheart," her father called. Through the door, James Washington looked handsome in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to Jasmine's law school graduation. He'd taken vacation days from his job at the automotive plant to help with wedding preparations, and Jasmine knew he was just as excited as she was. Downstairs, Alexander was pacing nervously in the groom's room. His best man, Tony, a friend from college who'd stuck by him through everything, was trying to calm him down. "She's going to say yes, man. She already said yes 6 months ago, remember?" Tony grinned. "Besides, after everything you two have been through, this is the easy part." Alexander nodded, but his stomach was still in knots. Not because he had any doubts about marrying Jasmine, but because he knew his family's absence would hurt her, even though she'd never admit it. His parents, his sister, his cousins, none of them were coming. The only Sterling family member who'd responded to the invitation was his grandfather, and even that had been uncertain until yesterday. The ceremony was set to take place in the mansion's garden, where white chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a beautiful archway covered in climbing roses. About 150 people had gathered, Jasmine's extended family, friends from law school, colleagues, neighbors, and community members whose lives she'd touched through her work. As the string quartet began playing, Alexander took his place at the altar. The music was performed by students from the local high school, and while they weren't the New York Philharmonic, they played with a joy and passion that made the simple melody sound like the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. The first surprise came when the processional began. Instead of just Jasmine's maid of honor walking down the aisle, Alexander saw a familiar figure making his way slowly but steadily toward the altar. His grandfather, William Sterling, the founder of Sterling Industries, was walking with Jasmine's father. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. His grandfather was 92 years old and rarely left his private care facility. The fact that he was here, that he'd chosen to come when the rest of the family had refused, meant everything. "Didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" the old man whispered as he took his seat in the front row. "Been looking forward to meeting this young lady who's made such an impression on my grandson." Then the bridal march began, and Alexander forgot about everything else. Jasmine appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in her simple dress, her arm linked with her father's. But she wasn't alone. On her other side walked her grandmother, Betty, looking proud and elegant in a navy blue dress she'd sewn herself. Sight of Jasmine walking toward him, supported by the two people who'd shaped her into the incredible woman she'd become, took Alexander's breath away. She looked confident, joyful, and absolutely glowing with happiness. Halfway down the aisle, there was another surprise. A black Mercedes pulled up to the mansion, and out stepped Victoria Sterling. Alexander's mother looked uncomfortable and out of place in her expensive clothes, but she was here. She stood at the back of the ceremony, not wanting to interrupt, but her presence sent a shock through the gathered crowd. Jasmine saw her too, and for a moment, her step faltered. But then she squeezed her father's arm and kept walking, her chin held high. She'd made peace with the possibility that Alexander's family might never accept her, and she wasn't going to let their absence or presence define her happiness. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. The pastor who'd known Jasmine's family for 20 years spoke about love that overcomes obstacles, about the courage it takes to choose each other every day, and about building a life based on shared values rather than shared circumstances. Love isn't always easy, he said, looking directly at the couple. But when it's real, when it's based on respect and understanding and genuine care for each other, it can move mountains. Alexander and Jasmine had written their own vows, and there wasn't a dry eye in the garden when they spoke. "Jasmine," Alexander said, his voice steady despite his emotions, "you taught me what it means to live authentically. You showed me that real wealth isn't about money or status. It's about making a difference in people's lives. You are my conscience, my inspiration, and my best friend. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of the love you've given me." Jasmine's vows were equally moving. "Alexander, you believed in me before I believed in myself. You saw past everything that made us different and found everything that makes us the same. You chose love over comfort, truth over convenience. I promise to keep challenging you to be your best self, just like you've always done for me." When they exchanged rings, the simple gold bands catching the afternoon sunlight, the crowd erupted in cheers. Alexander's grandfather was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, and even Victoria Sterling looked moved despite herself. The reception was unlike anything the Sterling family would have organized, and it was perfect. Instead of a formal sit-down dinner, there were long tables covered with red checkered tablecloths, featuring the best soul food Detroit had to offer. Mrs. Rosa had outdone herself with a spread that included everything from mac and cheese to perfectly seasoned fried chicken. Speeches were heartfelt rather than polished. Jasmine's brother talked about how she'd always fought for the underdog, even when they were kids. Alexander's grandfather surprised everyone by slowly making his way to the microphone. "I built a company, but I never built a family," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "Alexander, you found something more valuable than anything I ever created. Don't let anyone tell you different." The evening's most touching moment came when Victoria Sterling approached Jasmine during the dancing. The two women stood face to face, and for a moment, the entire reception seemed to hold its breath. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said quietly. "I was wrong about you about this." I can see how much you love my son and how much he loves you. I'd like a chance to start over, if you're willing." Jasmine looked at this woman who had caused her so much pain and chose grace over grudges. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Mrs. Sterling. I'd like that too." As the night wound down, Alexander and Jasmine stood on the mansion's terrace, watching their families and friends dancing together under the stars. The community that had rallied around them, the love that had sustained them through the hardest times, the future they were building together. It all felt magical and real at the same time. "No regrets?" Jasmine asked, leaning into her husband's arms. Alexander kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling more content than he'd ever imagined possible. "Only one," he said. "I wish I'd been brave enough to choose you sooner." They danced until midnight, surrounded by everyone who mattered, knowing they'd built something beautiful together, not just a marriage, but a bridge between two different worlds, proving that love really could conquer anything when it was strong enough and brave enough to try.